Hello everyone and welcome back to the Great Book of Grudges. My name is Nathan and today we're gonna jump into some deep lore. You see, the Warhammer Fantasy world is massive, and I mean that by every stretch of the word, as there's more or less evidence that the Warhammer Fantasy world is about 3 times the size of our own real world. Within it, many different races live there, establishing their own dominance throughout the massive stretch of territory. We've seen the Orcs controlling the Badlands, for example, the Chaos Dwarves taking over the Darklands, most of humanity centered around the area known as the Old World, Ogres in the Mountains of Morn, and so much more. But what if we started looking towards an area that is relatively unexplored in the Warhammer Fantasy setting? The oceans and bodies of water, which have their own living creatures, some more terrifying than even creatures that we see on land. And I would be inclined to agree. Not only do we know of gigantic creatures living in the oceans ready to snap up any sort of ships that may pass by, but there is reason to believe that there might be a rather powerful civilization within the depths of the ocean floor who were simply biding their time for the perfect time to strike. I'm of course referencing the Menfish, often sometimes known as Fishmen, simply enough. And yes, Warhammer Fantasy did have these way back in the day, where they were introduced when Warhammer was still in its infancy, right on 1st edition, and that's pretty much the most lore that we've ever had around them. However, there is a lot of theories regarding the Fishmen, and I want to explore that today. The main lore that we have around the Menfish is as follows, and just for a word of warning, I'm going to be interchanging it with Menfish and Fishmen as much as possible. Mostly on official sources, I'm going to call it Menfish, and when I'm talking about it from my own perspective, I'm going to go Fishmen, because it's just easier to call them Fishmen. Anyways, the Menfish is a strange synthesis of man and fish, humanoid but scaled, and capable of living underwater as well as on land. Citadel Menfish live in both the underwater caves of the sea and freshwater, being able to adapt easily to either environment. Independent by nature, they mount night attacks on the fishing villages of men, elves, goblins, and others with equal indifference. Menfish fear fire and direct sunlight, have night vision, and can move through or over water or boggy ground at normal speeds. Very few models for the Menfish or Fishmen actually existed. They were actually from a different range, from a different company, but were kind of absorbed in by Citadel, which was the whole thing of Games Workshop growing into its own thing. A further model was released for Warhammer 40k, which was a Menfish with a gun, but that's pretty much it. Now, what we do know from the little bit of lore is that they exist both in salt and fresh water, which is actually quite interesting, as that does mean that the Fishmen have extended their influence throughout many different areas in the Warhammer Fantasy world, areas that generally can't be colonized because, well, you know, humans, elves, and the like aren't really aquatic, are they? But that's more or less the extent of the lore that we do have on them. We don't know their gods, we don't know their customs. Many people do believe that they might be worshippers of some eldritch type of horror, going into more of a Lovecraftian feel for Warhammer Fantasy. And that could entirely be possible, considering that, yes, Warhammer Fantasy does take from established settings like Lovecraft and then twist it into its own. It's something that we've been seeing through a variety of different fantasy authors or writers in general, because it's very hard to speak to a fantasy writer and not have some sort of influence by H.P. Lovecraft. Now, before we continue, it is actually very important to note that the Fishmen or Menfish were not actually removed from Warhammer Fantasy lore, and still very much remain in canon despite the fact that they've just had no real significant mentions. But in 2014 we did have a novel released by Josh Reynolds. This was for Black Library as per usual, known as The Serpent Queen, and there was a little bit of a mention of the Fishmen themselves. Don't look so worried, manling. Remember our time with Long John? It'll be just like that, he said, tapping the side of his nose. That's what I'm worried about, Felix said. They'd spent a month aboard the ironclad warship of the infamous Slayer pirate. He and Gotrek had got along like, well, slayers. Felix had experienced the worst seasickness of his life aboard the cramped and foul-smelling vessel, and things hadn't got any better when Drong and Gotrek had bullied him aboard Malachi Mackason's experimental undersea exploration vessel. things hadn't got any better once they hit the ocean floor either. He pushed that particular memory aside. No fishmen though, Gotrek added. Thank the gods for small favors, Felix muttered. So, fishmen still exist. Never mind the fact that Malachi was able to make some sort of submarine, which seems a bit much even for Warhammer Fantasy, but then again, stranger things have happened. This novel keeps the fishmen in recent memory, and it's the whole door ajar situation. Nothing, unless it's extremely problematic, gets removed, just in case Games Workshop and maybe certain authors wish to use it in the future. Which makes me believe that they have been used in canon before, just with a different name and possibly changing up their origins ever so slightly. Well, in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, we are introduced to some native creatures in Bretonnia known as the Lakemen, which their lore goes as follows. Lakemen are a variety of beastmen found primarily in the Leonen region of the Forest of Arden, though they swim out to plague the rest of southern Lyonesse with depressing frequency. They all have a vaguely amphibian appearance, often with faces resembling frogs, pincers in place of hands, and gills allowing them to breathe underwater. However, they are more variable than normal beastmen, and all lakemen have at least one other mutation. Lakemen prefer to attack from the water, as this gives them the advantage of surprise in most cases, but they are no more adept in water than any other skilled swimmer. Whilst they are as violent and bloodthirsty as beastmen, the two groups have never been observed to cooperate, and have been known to fight each other for no readily apparent reason. So here we find another fishman-like creature, but more amphibian than fish. And they are linked up to beastmen, which is actually quite interesting, because it could be very much true that the lakemen, and by extension the fishmen, could be true beastmen. You see, the beastmen came into being when a giant chaos storm basically took over the Warhammer Fantasy world for a short period. What happened there is peasants, farmers, hunters, pretty much a lot of people were horribly mutated with the animals that kept company with them, where two creatures essentially became one through horrible mutation. It's very possible that the lakemen and the fishmen also came into being through this. You see, you could have men fishing on the lakes, tending to lake gardens and so on, and also fishermen in the beaches and the oceans. When in fresh bodies of water, it's very possible that you'd be near frogs, and yeah, especially since we know in Bretonnia, frogs are considered food. We know of frog wives who are actively hunting for frogs to sell at marketplaces, so this is the birth of the lakemen. The same thing could be said for men of Marienburg, men of the Empire Nordland, anything coastal region. If some unfortunate person or group of people were out and about with a very large stock of possibly still living fish, this could end up as the unfortunate reality for them. So I very much believe that the lakemen and the fishmen are beastmen by nature. Well, we wouldn't really call it nature, but by chaotic interference. With the lakemen being considered the freshwater fishmen and the fishmen themselves being the saltwater ones. It does actually make a lot of sense when you go into beastmen lore. The majority of the beastmen that we do know are, well, goats, mostly goats and minotaurs, but if you go into beastmen lore, we know that ape men exist, tiger men, and even some hints towards avian men, right? Not like the crow men of Grand Cafe, but rather men who have mutated with birds. Keep in mind that the creation of the Beastmen was a long time ago, so this theory could actually be wrong, and maybe the fishmen and lakemen have always existed. The roleplay books are always written to the perspective of a writer, so the in-universe historian that actually did write this could have actually been wrong, and they just existed long before even the coming of the old ones. But I have the following theory. The fishmen and the lakemen were created the same as the beastmen. The chaos storm brought them into being as creatures of the ocean, but the powers of chaos might not go down that far. There's a lot of creatures within the oceans of the Warhammer Fantasy world, which, while looking fairly chaotic, don't seem to be aligned to any of the Chaos Gods in general. This could possibly be because Stormfells does hold a lot of sway in the oceans and probably protects it from the warping powers of chaos. So while the fishmen were twisted and turned, the deeper into the oceans they got, the safer it was for them, and they slowly broke away from the chaotic powers, eventually just becoming their own thing. Whether or not they worship Stormfells or they've willed another deity into existence is unknown, and it's something that we could possibly hear about in the future. With the release of Warhammer the Old World hopefully coming at some point before I die of old age, it could be a perfect time for writers within the universe to maybe explore stuff that was just never explored before. But what do you think about the Fishmen and by extension the Lakemen? Are they Beastmen? Are they their own thing? Is there an Eldritch God hiding deep within the oceans? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a bit of a discussion. Kind of want to start covering a little bit more lore stuff. I'll be honest with you, I'm a little bit burnt out with Total War. As you guys are aware, it's not been a great time lately, so for the benefit of my mental health, I feel like doing a little bit of a pivot and talking about the things that make me happy, like theory crafting, these types of things. But yeah, let's have a bit of a discussion. Hopefully you guys like these videos, and we'll see where we can progress. I'll see you all again very, very soon. Have a good day.